Do not pity me, human." The words came out ragged, forced through clenched teeth. Her leg was pinned beneath a fallen wagon wheel, iron rim biting into muscle, blood soaking dark into the frozen mud. Rain hammered the ruined trade road, and she was alone, no guards, no kin, nothing but a torn cloak too fine for a wanderer. Elin had been riding the fence line when the storm caught him, and he swung down from his horse and ran toward her anyway. Nothing on him but a worn ranch knife and years of hard work behind him. Boots slipping in mud already gone to slick, cold ruin under the storm. He didn't know orcs could bleed like this, didn't know why one lay abandoned on a road no merchant used anymore. He knelt, working the wheel with his shoulder, mud soaking through his knees, rain running cold down his collar, the iron rim biting into his own hands now too. She hissed, gripping his wrist hard enough to bruise, and beneath the torn sleeve, a signet ring caught the last grey light. Round her throat, half buried in mud, hung a pendant of dark iron shaped like a closed fist, crowned in thorn. He got the wheel off her and had made it 3 steps toward the tree line when a voice cut through the rain behind him, sharp enough to carry over the storm entirely, cold enough that it seemed to cut straight through the noise of the rain itself, formal in a way that no ordinary traveler on this road would ever have used. "Your Majesty," he froze, rain running cold down the back of his collar. The voice cut off as fast as it came. When he turned, there was nothing behind him but rain and an empty road. Caithra's hand closed hard on his arm, and she breathed one word, "Down," and pulled him into the ditch in a heartbeat before 5 riders came around the bend at a gallop. They didn't dismount. They stared at the blood pooled in the mud where she'd fallen, and something in that stain made them turn as one and ride back the way they'd come. Slean lay in the ditch with a bleeding stranger's full weight against his chest, and understood, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the rain, that he had just hidden something men were willing to hunt across a storm to find. He asked her who she was. She told him only that it did not matter tonight, and that if he wanted to live past it, he would forget the voice and the men and carry her the rest of the way home. What was she running from that made grown warriors turn back at the sight of her blood alone? Hey, Orcbond Saga family, before Elin discovers who Caithra truly is, subscribe to Orcbond Saga and become part of their unforgettable journey. Smash the hype button if you're ready to see where one act of kindness leads. The ranch house was poor, and it was his, and it was the only shelter for a mile in any direction, which was the only reason it mattered tonight. He'd left his horse tied at the fence post and carried her the rest of the way by himself, unwilling to trust a spooked animal with an injured stranger draped across its back in weather like this. Elin Sorel was 31, a rancher with no family left. He'd laid her on his one bed and worked the wound the way an old healer had taught him. Clean, press, pack, wrap loose enough to breathe. The wound itself ran deep along her calf, muscle visible in the firelight, and he worked in silence, aware the whole time of how still she'd gone, watching him with an intensity that made the back of his neck prickle. She didn't flinch when he pressed hardest against the bleeding. She only breathed slower, deliberately, the way someone breathes when they've trained themselves not to give pain the satisfaction of a sound. He noticed, cleaning the mud from her leg, an old scar running the length of her thigh, long-healed, the kind only a blade left behind. He noticed a second one across her ribs, thinner, more recent. He said nothing about either, and kept working, hands steadier than he felt. She watched him find them and said nothing either, though something in her eyes told him this wasn't the first time she'd bled for a throne. She'd never once been allowed to simply sit on in peace. "Why?" she asked when she could speak again. "Why help me?" He told her he wasn't in the habit of leaving people to die in the mud, and went back to his work. He didn't sleep that first night, sitting by the hearth long after her breathing evened out, wondering exactly how much danger he'd carried through his own door. On the 3rd night, something moved outside that wasn't the wind. He heard it as a held silence where the ordinary sounds of the place should have been. No horses stirring in the corral, no cattle shifting in the dark, not even the small rustle of creatures settling for the night. He took up his knife and stood listening until whatever it was moved off, unhurried, as though it had seen exactly what it came to see and had no further reason to stay. In the morning, he found a dead hare strung up from the corral fence, throat cut clean, left facing the ranch house door. Kethra studied it without touching it and told him only that some messages didn't need words to be understood. She didn't explain what the message was. He didn't ask twice. For 2 days after, neither of them strayed far from the walls. It was the 5th evening, the ranch house gone soft with firelight, when the shutter beside the bed exploded inward, an arrow burying itself in the post a hand's width from her skull. No second shot came. Whoever had lost it was already gone by the time Eileen got the door open. No tracks worth following in the dark. If the shot had been a warning, what exactly were they waiting to see her do before the next one came? And who, precisely, had a hand steady enough to miss on purpose in the pitch dark? A trader named Corin passed the road on the 8th day and came no closer than the yard. One glimpse through the window was enough. He went pale, asked Eileen very quietly whether the woman inside wore a mark on her arm like a broken circle. Eileen admitted that she did. Corin didn't explain. He said only that Eileen should pray whatever he was doing was worth what it would cost him, and left faster than he'd arrived. Before he rode off, he added, almost as an afterthought, that his son Bren watched the eastern road most weeks now, and that if trouble ever came looking for Eileen from that direction, the boy would likely see it coming before Eileen did. He didn't come back down that road for 11 days after, and when he finally did, he wouldn't meet Eileen's eyes at all. As though even looking at the ranch house too directly might mark him as complicit in whatever was coming. Eileen asked him once, gently, what exactly he'd been so afraid of. Corin only shook his head and said that some names were safer left unspoken until the people carrying them decided otherwise. 2 days later, a lone rider stopped at the tree line, took 3 steps toward the ranch house, and then dropped to one knee in the mud and stayed there until Kethra told him sharply to rise and ride on before he brought others down on both their heads. He obeyed, though he lingered a moment too long at the tree line first, looking back once as though memorizing the place for a reason he never explained. Eileen said nothing about it that night, but he noticed, watching her face after the rider vanished, that whatever she was, it frightened her more than the men hunting her did. What kind of woman makes armed strangers kneel in the mud without being asked? And what does she have to fear from her own people finding out where she is? She healed, and the days took a shape neither of them planned. He gave her the bed and slept by the hearth. She asked why. He told her only that she was healing and he wasn't. She turned the answer over for a long while, unused to a kindness that asked nothing back. Her strength returned faster than the wound should have allowed. She helped him reset a leaning fence post one morning, driving it into the ground with a force that would have taken him 3 swings of the mallet to match, and looked smug about it despite what it cost her leg. He laughed. That was the first time she laughed too, startled, quickly caught, as though it were a weakness she rationed. She demanded half seriously that he admit she was better at the work than he was. He refused, and the argument that followed lasted longer than either of them would have admitted to enjoying. She proved less patient with the horses than with the fence work. The mare he kept for riding the range didn't trust her size or her smell at first, and Kethra took the animal's wariness as a personal insult until Eileen showed her how to stand still and let the horse come to her instead of the other way around. It took 4 days of quiet mornings in the corral before the mare would eat from her hand, and when it finally did, Kethra looked more pleased by that small victory than she had by anything since the road. One afternoon, watching him drive fence posts with more strength than technique, she stopped him and showed him something instead, not a soldier's drill. Just one simple thing, how to step into a strike rather than away from it, closing the distance so a bigger opponent's reach became useless instead of dangerous. She made him practice it until his shoulder ached. refusing to let him stop after only a few tries, telling him in her usual blunt way that a man who only knew how to run from danger would spend his whole life running. He grumbled about it for days. He never forgot it. Their customs collided once sharply. He offered her his cloak against the cold. She refused it flatly, telling him that among her people, offering warmth to someone capable of making their own was an insult dressed as kindness. He apologized out of habit. She told him to stop apologizing and simply ask instead. He noticed, not for the first time, that she flinched slightly whenever he apologized too many times in a row, though it took him weeks to understand that flinch had nothing to do with him at all. One evening, mending her ruined cloak by firelight, she told him, without being asked, that she hadn't cried since her mother's funeral, and that some nights in this ranch house she'd come closer to it than she had in years, not from grief, but from the strange, disarming relief of being somewhere no one expected anything from her at all. He didn't tell her that made two of them. He didn't need to. They risked the village market on the 12th day, her hood pulled low, her height explained away as a tall cousin visiting from the coast. For nearly an hour it worked. She lifted a cart to prove a point to a delighted child who'd mistaken her for some traveling performer, laughing freely in public for the first time since the road. Eileen bought her a plain green ribbon, dyed the same deep shade as her ruined cloak, and she wore it the rest of the morning without once asking why he'd chosen that color, though he suspected she already knew. Then an old woman selling dried herbs looked too long at the tattoo peeking from her sleeve, and went white in the way people go, white when they've recognized something they weren't supposed to see. Kethra pulled her sleeve down and steered them both toward the tree line without a word, walking fast but not running, and it was only once the market noise faded behind them that she admitted, quietly, that the old woman's face was one she might have seen before. Once at court, in a life that felt impossibly far from this one now, if a single old woman in a village market can recognize a queen at a glance, how long can 9 borrowed days possibly last against a world already looking for her? While the ranch house learned to laugh, General Draka Osvene was teaching a border village a different lesson. He rode into Millow's Ford at dawn, 3 days after a rumor reached him that the village had sheltered a rider matching Kethra's description on her flight from the capital. He found no queen there, only farmers, and an elder named Osk, who insisted honestly that no such rider had ever passed through. Drakor didn't believe him, or didn't care whether he was lying. He had the man dragged into the square in front of the whole village, broke his jaw with the flat of a gauntlet for the insult of denying him an answer he wanted, and stood over him afterward, calm as a man discussing the weather, telling the gathered crowd that honesty was the only currency he still respected, and that Osk had just spent his last of it. He burned 3 storehouses to the ground before riding, and not because the grain mattered to his search, but because a village that watched its winter stores go up in flames would think twice before sheltering anyone again. He took the elder's youngest grandson with him as he left, a boy no older than 7, hauled up onto a saddle in front of one of his riders, while the boy's mother screamed herself hoarse at the edge of the square, held back by 3 of Drakor's own men who did not look at her while they did it. Drakor told the weeping village that the child would be returned unharmed the moment someone brought him proof of the queen's whereabouts, and not one moment before, and rode out of Millow's Ford without once looking back at the smoke rising behind him. Word of Millow's Ford reached the capital within days, and reached Kethra herself not long after that, second-hand, through a frightened trader too afraid to carry the story any further than her own door. She did not sleep that night. She had spent years believing Drakor ambitious, even ruthless, but she had not believed, until the story of a burned village and a stolen child reached her, that he had stopped pretending to be anything other than what he actually was. A general willing to take a child hostage over a rumor was not a man who could be reasoned with, bargained with, or shamed back into the boundaries he'd once at least pretended to respect. The boy was never returned. No one ever confirmed to her whether he lived. He woke past midnight to an empty bed. Her boots were gone from beside the door, her tracks leading off the trail into black trees. The forest was silent in the way that only ever means something is wrong. No owls, no wind, not even the small rustle of creatures settling for the night. He followed, knife gripped tight, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, and stopped dead at the tree line above a small clearing. 8 men lay scattered across the frozen ground. Kethra stood among them, breathing hard, blood on her knuckles that weren't hers, finishing the last of them with a motion so fast, and finally his stomach turned over before his mind caught up. A 9th shape broke from the tree line before she turned to face him fully, lean, silent, faster than the rest, and vanished into the dark, rather than risk becoming a 10th body in that clearing. She hadn't called for help. She hadn't woken him. She had walked out alone, on a leg not fully healed, and killed 8 trained killers without a sound loud enough to reach the ranch house. He beat her back inside, lay down, pretended to sleep, heart still hammering against his ribs. She slid back into the bed as if she'd never left it. In the morning, neither of them said a word. He handed her tea the way he had every morning. She took it the way she always did, though he noticed for the first time a fresh scrape along her knuckles. She made no effort to hide from him this time, as though some quiet agreement had passed between them in the silence of not discussing it. He told himself the danger was over now. It felt, for almost a full week, like they'd won something. The hair stopped appearing. No more silences held outside the window. Even Kethra seemed to breathe easier, sleeping through full nights for the first time since the wheel had broken on that road. They hadn't won anything. One of the dead men had carried, sewn into his collar, a torn scrap of parchment bearing a single symbol, the same closed fist from her pendant crossed through with a single black line. Neither of them found it. It would be weeks before either learned what that mark actually meant, and by then it would already be too late for the knowing to help them. Hey, Orcbond Saga family. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Who do you think Kethra really is? Pause for a second and leave your guess in the comments before the truth is revealed. Let's back to the story. Riders came again on the 14th day, the same 5 as the road, and this time they didn't turn back. The lead rider knelt in the mud, rain soaking through his armor, and said the clanhold had searched 3 provinces and would not leave this one without her. Behind him, the other 4 sat their horses in tense formation, watching the tree line, as though they expected the ambush that had nearly killed her once to find them again in exactly this clearing. Hands never straying far from the hilts at their sides, Kethra told him she would come, but not without the man who'd kept her alive. The rider's eyes flicked once to Elin standing in the doorway, a rancher whose only real experience with danger had come from storms, wild cattle, and lonely roads, not war. And something in his expression made plain exactly how strange this would sound, repeated back at court. Elin looked at her. The pendant, the tattoo, the bearing that had never once belonged to anyone but a ruler, and asked her, plainly, who she was. She told him. Queen of the Ashwood clanhold, fled from her own council's betrayal, hunted 3 provinces by men who wanted her dead before she reclaimed a throne that was hers by right. She said it without ornament, her hands, for the first time since he'd known her, not quite steady at her sides. Silence answered her, longer than she expected. In it, something in him closed like a door. Now that he knew the truth, would it change what he felt for her, or only what he believed he deserved? He said he understood now why she'd never once let herself be at ease in his house. She told him some cowardly, hopeful part of her had wanted just once to be someone's guest instead of someone's queen. He heard her, and the anger softened, but not all of it. He told her she should go. She went that morning, too proud to ask him to stop her, too hurt himself to try. The ranch house felt larger than it had any right to. Every corner held some small evidence she'd been there, a cup she'd favored, a blanket folded the particular way she folded things, and he found himself talking to the empty room out of habit before catching himself. hating how much the silence afterward reminded him of years he thought he'd already survived once. He kept the green ribbon from the market tucked inside his father's game of carved counters, and told himself he didn't know why he'd bothered keeping it at all. At court, she fared no better. The great hall she'd known her whole life felt suddenly foreign, full of advisers watching her with the careful, assessing eyes of people waiting to see whether grief or distraction would cost the clanhold something they couldn't afford to lose. She sat through council sessions in a language of careful diplomacy she'd forgotten how to speak fluently, catching herself reaching for the plain, undressed words she'd used with Elin, only to remember she couldn't afford them here. At night, alone in chambers too large for one person, she found herself listening for a rancher's breathing on the other side of a hearth that no longer existed, and hating how much that particular silence had come to feel like the only kind of quiet that had ever actually rested her. An elder named Pharaoh Ashgale cornered her privately and told her, without cruelty but without softness either, that a queen who chose a human over her throne's dignity gave every rival clan a story to tell for a generation. Gethra told the old elder only that her mother had died surrounded by advisers and known by none of them, and that whatever the clanhold paid for her choice, she would rather pay it than end the same way. Draco did not wait for private corners to make his contempt known. He cornered Pharaoh himself in open council only days later, when the old elder dared suggest that the general's growing influence over the border garrisons deserved closer scrutiny, and answered the suggestion by telling Pharaoh in front of the full assembly that men too old to hold a blade steady had no business questioning men who still could, and that the clanhold's true weakness wasn't a queen who'd sheltered with a human, but elders who mistook long memory for continued relevance. He let the silence that followed stretch long enough for everyone in the hall to understand exactly how little the old elder's decades of service counted for anymore, then moved on to the next matter, as though he'd merely commented on the weather. Pharaoh said nothing further that session, and several younger councillors who might once have backed him found themselves suddenly reluctant to be seen agreeing with the man Draco had just humiliated so publicly. Draco received word she'd returned with a human at her side and told his officers she'd done half his work for him. He began calling in old debts, patient in the way only a man certain of his own victory can afford to be, and it was that patience, more than any burned village, that made him truly dangerous, because a man in no hurry rarely makes the mistakes that get him caught. There was one night, deep into that difficult stretch, when Kethra came closer than she ever admitted to sending a rider back for him, regardless of the cost. She sat alone with a letter half-written, the words refusing to arrange themselves into anything that didn't sound like begging, and burned the page rather than send it, watching the ash curl up the chimney, telling herself, without much conviction, that a queen who called a man back into danger for her own comfort was no better than the council she despised for treating people as pieces on a board. She did not know that night that Elin was doing much the same thing a day's ride away, standing at the edge of the trade road more than once, halfway through packing what little he owned, only to stop himself each time with the same bitter reasoning that showing up uninvited at a queen's court, unable to offer her anything but a rancher's hands, might do her more harm than good. Corin brought word 5 days later the queen had been ambushed again in sight of her own capital, and the man behind it was Dracor himself, who had spent 3 years building support for a marriage she'd fled and had finally run out of patience. Elin took his knife and started walking toward the capital. He didn't make it a full day before the road tried to kill him. A rider broke from the tree line at dusk, blade drawn, and Elin had no memory afterward of deciding to dive for the ditch rather than stand his ground, only the blur of hooves passing close enough to feel the heat off the horse, mud kicking up hard against his face as he rolled clear of the first pass. He owed his life to a stranger's arrow that took the man from his saddle at the last possible moment. The stranger introduced himself as Bren, Corin's son, the same name Corin had mentioned once weeks ago watching the Eastern Road, sent by his father to shadow Elin once word of Dracor's plans had spread. Bren stayed close after that, quiet, watchful, checking Elin's wounds with brisk, practical hands, and Elin exhausted, grateful, already half remembering the name from that first conversation with Corin, never once questioned how conveniently that arrow had arrived, or how a farmer's son had known exactly which stretch of road to wait on. 2 full days before Elin himself had decided to walk it at all, he should have questioned it. 2 days from the capital, Bren led them off the main road, claiming a shortcut through a ravine that would save them half a day's walk, and it was only the sudden, wrong silence of that ravine. No birds, no wind. The same held stillness Elin remembered from the night of the hare, that made him stop walking at all. The rock walls rose close on either side, narrow enough that 2 men couldn't have passed each other without turning sideways, and Elin found himself thinking absurdly that this was exactly the kind of place he'd have chosen himself if he'd wanted to make certain no one walking through it walked back out. His own heartbeat sounded too loud in the sudden quiet, loud enough that he wondered briefly whether Bren could hear it too. He noticed, too late to matter if Bren had meant it to go differently, that the young man's hand had drifted to the hilt of his knife the moment Elin slowed, and that Bren's eyes kept flicking to a bend in the rock ahead where nothing should have needed watching so carefully. Bren didn't draw the knife. He stood there instead, jaw working, and admitted, in a voice gone suddenly younger than his years, that Dracor had bought his father's debts 8 months ago and threatened to ruin the whole family unless Bren fed him whatever he learned of the Queen's location. The road ambush had been real. The arrow had been real. The rescue had been real, because Dracor had wanted Elin alive and trusting exactly long enough to walk him somewhere quieter than a crowded capital gate. This ravine, these rocks, men already waiting behind the bend, Bren couldn't stop glancing toward. He said he'd meant to go through with it. He said, standing there with his hand still on the knife, that he suddenly, badly, didn't want to. Elin didn't wait to see which choice won. He ran, and Bren, to his own visible shock, let him go, shouting nothing after him, drawing no blade. Standing alone in that ravine, long after the sound of Elin's footsteps had faded into the trees, he ran until his legs gave out, and then walked, and ran again when they recovered enough to carry him, covering in half a day what should have taken him a full one, expecting at every bend in the road to find Dracor's men waiting where Bren's men hadn't been. None came, whether Bren had warned them off, or simply never told them which way Elin had actually fled. He never learned, and by the time the capital's outer walls finally rose into view against the grey sky, he was too exhausted to feel anything but the cold, hollow certainty that he'd very nearly not made it at all, and the equally cold certainty that whatever waited for him inside those walls would need every last piece of strength he had left. Whether Dracor ever learned his hired eyes had failed him twice, no one in this story ever found out. If the boy who saved your life once can be bought to end it the second time, who else along the road has already been paid for? And how much of what felt like rescue was only ever a longer trap? In the capital, word reached Dracor that the Queen's return was imminent, and rather than steady him, the news made him crueler than his own officers had yet seen. One captain suspected, on nothing more than a rumor, of divided loyalty never lived to see the following dawn. It was the closest any of his own men ever came to fearing him, more than they feared the Queen he meant to replace. Guards at the capital gate nearly stopped him before Dracor's men needed to. It was Earsil Dunhollow, an old advisor hurrying from the loyalist camp, who recognized him and got him through, telling him to move fast and stay behind the line, because an untrained human wandering into what was coming would only hand Dracor another hostage. The city was too quiet for midday. Shutters were closed along streets that should have been full of trade, and the few faces Elin passed watched him go with the particular stillness of people who already knew violence was coming and had decided which doors to bar rather than which side to stand on. Urzel moved fast despite his age, cutting through side streets Elin would never have found alone, and twice pulled him into a doorway to let armed men pass whose colors neither of them recognized, muttering once that the general had bought more loyalty in the capital than anyone in the loyalist camp had wanted to believe. They heard the fighting before they saw the hall. Steel on steel beneath the low roar of a frightened crowd. The hall itself was already a storm of smoke and torchlight when Elin reached it, a tapestry caught in flame along one wall, loyalist warriors holding a shrinking line against Dracor's better-armed faction. Kethra fought the general blade to blade at the center of it, giving ground she couldn't afford to give, favoring a leg that hadn't fully forgotten the wagon wheel that broke it weeks before. And for a moment, watching from the doorway, Elin genuinely couldn't tell which side was winning at all. For a long, terrible stretch it looked as though she might lose. Then the loyalist line surged, driving Draco's faction back toward the far doors in a ragged, scrambling retreat, and someone near the front shouted that the general had broken and ran. Blades lowered across the hall. A cheer started before it had any right to. For one full breath it looked like it was already over. It wasn't. Draco hadn't run at all. He'd only fallen back far enough to see clearly. And from the threshold, he found exactly what he'd been looking for, Elin standing unarmed among the loyalists. The human whose mere existence had cost the general 3 years of patience he no longer had any intention of spending. He turned and drove back into the hall alone, faster than anyone braced for a retreating man to move. Blade already raised toward the one target no one had thought to guard. Kethra reached him a half-second before the blade did. She threw herself into its path without a heartbeat's hesitation, taking a wound across her ribs that dropped her to one knee, and Elin, furious, finally moving instead of frozen, didn't step back from Dracor's next strike the way every instinct screamed at him to. He stepped into it instead, exactly the way she'd drilled into his aching shoulder weeks ago in a ranch house yard that felt like another lifetime now, closing the distance until the general's greater reach counted for nothing at all. Dracor was faster, better trained, and should have ended the exchange in a single stroke. It was only the general's own certainty that a rancher posed no real threat that gave Elin the half-second opening he needed. The blow he landed was clean, where it should have been clumsy, aimed exactly where she'd once told him to aim, and it opened enough of a gap for the loyal guard to close in from 3 sides at once. Draco did not survive what came after. Among his belongings, Urzel found nothing that explained why a decorated general had thrown away 3 years of patience for a throne he could never have held for long, even if he'd won it. Some men, Urzel said afterward, needed no reason beyond the wanting. Kethra was not entirely sure she believed that, but she had a kingdom to steady and a wound still knitting in her side, and some questions, she decided, were not hers to spend what was left of that year chasing. Elin knelt beside Kethra on the cold stone, pressing his hand hard against the wound in her side, refusing to freeze until the healers pulled her, alive, out of his shaking hands. He stood outside the door. They wouldn't let him through for the rest of that night, refusing every offer of a chair, because sitting down felt too much like giving up. Urzel brought him water twice and took it away untouched both times. Somewhere past midnight, a healer finally opened the door long enough to tell him the bleeding had slowed, and that whether she lived through the night would likely be decided before dawn one way or the other. He spent those remaining hours the way he'd once spent the worst night of his life, outside another sick-room door. Except this time he did not freeze, did not look away, did not let himself imagine anything beyond the next breath she might or might not take. She woke a full day later and told him she'd heard, somewhere in the fever, a memory that wasn't her own, his sister's wooden sword, swinging at shadows, laughing, certain nothing bad could happen to her. She told him she intended to have one made, carved with both their names, so the girl who never got to grow up would still, in her way, stand guard over the life her brother had finally chosen. She caught him still hovering by the bed days later, checking her bandages for the third time that morning, though the healers had already cleared her twice. "Do not pity me, human," she told him, dry, almost smiling, the exact words from a rain-soaked road that felt a lifetime behind them now. "You still don't listen," he said. "No," she agreed. "I never did. They did not win easy peace. Some in the clan never fully warmed to a human near the throne." Elin missed sometimes the quiet of the ranch house, and didn't pretend otherwise. The wooden sword was finished within the season, carved by the same artisan who'd once shaped weapons for Kethra's mother's guard, inscribed with Tamsin's name beside an Orc word, meaning watchful, and hung above whichever hearth they occupied that month. The capital's private chambers in winter, the ranch house in warmer seasons. Neither of them ever needed to explain why it mattered. Elin still sometimes stood before it in quiet moments, saying nothing at all, and Kethra never once interrupted those silences. Pharaoh Ashgale, who had once warned her so sharply about legacy, watched 2 full seasons pass with the border holding steadier under a human's careful eye for terrain than it ever had before, and softened without ever quite admitting it aloud. He was, in fact, the first among the old guard to use Elin's given name in open council, a small courtesy that spread through the halls faster than any decree could have managed on its own. Their days took on a rhythm neither of them could have imagined during those first wary hours by the roadside. Mornings belonged to the practical business of the clanhold, grain counts and border reports, and the small, grinding work of governing people who had not yet fully forgiven their queen for the choice she'd made. Evenings belonged to whatever was left of them by then, which was usually not much, though even a single hour by a fire that wasn't smoking anymore felt, to both of them, like more than either had once believed they'd get to keep. Elin found his own place, slowly, not as a ruler exactly, but as something the court eventually learned to trust regardless, a quiet advisor with a rancher's practical eye for terrain and supply lines, a steady presence in council sessions he'd once found unbearably foreign, a husband who never stopped apologizing for small things out of habit, though Kethra had long since stopped minding, and had even on occasion started apologizing back, just to watch the confusion cross his face before he caught the joke. She, in turn, learned to let her guard down in rooms beyond that one small ranch house, discovering that the directness she'd always worn like armor could soften, occasionally, without costing her anything at all. She never fully stopped watching doorways the way she had that first night on the road, though the habit gentled over time into something closer to simple attentiveness than fear. The ranch house still stood, kept for the rare weeks they slipped away together, and it was there, a year on, that the story circled back to where it began. Kethra asked him, by the fire, if he remembered how frightened he'd looked freeing her from that wheel. He told her he remembered it perfectly, remembered thinking he had no idea what he was walking toward, only that he couldn't walk away. She told him she remembered thinking the same thing about him, though she'd been too proud then to say so. Neither of them needed words to fill the quiet between them anymore. The fire had burned low, the way it always did this time of night, and outside, the wind had finally settled after a long, restless evening, leaving the whole ranch house wrapped in the particular stillness that only ever comes after a storm has fully passed. Outside the ranch house, the next morning, in the thin grey light before the household woke, a small figure crossed the yard alone, no older than 5 or 6. Orc-strong in the shoulders, but human slight through the face, dark hair loose and unbraided, dragging a wooden sword nearly as tall as she was through the frost, swinging it at shadows with the same fierce, fearless concentration her mother gave everything. Humming a tune no one in this story ever explained where she'd learned, she came back inside only once, briefly, holding up something small and dull grey that she'd found in a box Kethra had never quite finished unpacking. "Mama, whose ring is this?" she asked. Kethra took it from her small hand and turned it slowly in the morning light. The same way Rain had once caught it on a forgotten road, neither of them had ever fully stopped thinking about. Elin, watching from the doorway with 2 cups of tea going cold in his hands, said nothing at all. Though something in his face made plain, he remembered exactly where that ring had first caught the light, and exactly whose wrist it had been on when it did. Kethra told her daughter only that it was hers once, from a life before this one, and that she'd never had it reset into gold. Because some part of her had always known the story wasn't quite finished being told yet, no one asked what she meant. No one needed to, not yet. Every great story leaves behind one unforgettable moment. Tell me in the comments which scene from Elin and Kethra's journey stayed with you the most. Then subscribe to Orcbond Saga and hit the hype button so you don't miss our next epic tale.